Glenn Hubbard was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for the first 2 years of the Bush administration, and is on many financial advisory boards, hedge funds, BlackRock, which is kind of a complicated partial hedge fund, partial investment bank. He's on the board of MetLife, large insurance company, many other financial involvements. He's also frequently an expert witness in both civil and criminal cases in defense of the financial services industry, in both lawsuits and criminal trials. Richard Portis, he's American, but has lived and worked in England for a long time, probably the most prominent economist in the United Kingdom, founding director of the UK Center for Economic Policy Research, very prominent guy. He also was heavily paid by the Icelandic banks in 2007 to write a glowing report about the Icelandic banks. And there are many other senior economists who are kind of in this category. In the second group are economists who've worked primarily for non-financial industries, telecommunications, energy, antitrust defendants, and they too are very prominent people. Some of them are at MIT. The Law and Economics Consulting Group, which was founded by a group of Berkeley professors and specializes in doing this kind of consulting. I invite you to look at their website, lecg.com, and see who's there. LECG is now a $350 million publicly held company. So this is, this is big business now. And a very high fraction of the time that an economist testifies in Congress or testifies in a regulatory proceeding or makes a public policy statement about the financial services industry, it's quite likely that they were paid to do so. So why, in turn, did that occur? That meaning the rise of the political power of a single industry. And that's where explanations get much, much more complicated. And I would not pretend to have anything close to a complete explanation of what's occurred, but it does seem clear that something has very deeply changed in the United States, and that change began around the time that the United States began to encounter productivity and competitiveness difficulties in the 1970s. And it seems to have been a relatively uninterrupted process, in the sense that it has not been particularly sensitive to which party was in power or to which part of the business cycle the United States economy was in. It's been relatively continuous. And in particular, this, which you can't see, is the share of U.S. total national income held by the top 1% of the U.S. population. It's gone from 9% to 23% in the last quarter century. This is hours worked per year for the average American, which has been going up sharply. This is U.S. household indebtedness. Now, I will conclude by giving you, to the extent that I think I have a partial explanation for what's been going on, my best stab at it. And here is what it is. That there has evolved a political duopoly in the United States in which the two political parties agree to agree on certain things and agree to disagree on others. And in particular, they agree on things related to finance and money, and they disagree on social policy. And this has potentially quite powerful consequences relative to their ability to retain legitimacy in the United States, because the disagreements on social policy are very real and very important. And what you see is both political parties and their candidates and people soliciting money, contributions, from the base of either of the parties, using those social policy issues in order to retain allegiance from the base, even in the face of the two parties' shared agreement to leave the economic and financial issues alone. Now, that duopoly, a sustainable duopoly, depends on the absence both of internal challenges from within the party and also the absence of competitive entry. And I've been speaking about this with people who specialize in the study of political systems and democratic systems. Larry Diamond, for example, at Stanford, who's probably America's leading expert on democracy. And Larry, in particular, thinks that the lack of a parliamentary system and the lack of ranked order voting are very important necessary conditions to the sustainability of this political duopoly. So why, in the face of this, is there not a more organized response, either independent of political parties or an attempt to create a third political party? And the answer is that if you look at the recent history of third parties in the United States, particularly those on the left, the last reasonably clean example would be Ralph Nader. What you see is that because of the lack of a parliamentary system and because of the lack of ranked order voting, the effect of a small fraction of the population going to a third party is to defeat the neighboring party in political terms. And so that also serves as a reinforcement to the political duopoly. And my sense in talking with I don't have much contact. I have some with senior people in the Republican Party. I have a fair amount of contact with senior people in the Democratic Party. And my quite strong sense is that this is something that is now explicitly understood. And I think that although it's removed at several levels from the immediate forces that affected the financial crisis and the deregulatory impulses and the lack of law enforcement that allowed the behavior that led to the crisis, I think that ultimately it's some kind of explanation like that you have to rely on. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. I know it's late, so if you have to leave, please do. There are two mics up here. What I would suggest is you come up to the mic and ask a question. Both sides.
I have two questions that are related. One is economic and one is political. So from what I read, there are two trends in economic thinking nowadays about how to deal with the economic crisis. One school of thought says spend, and the other says cut. My first question is, where do you come on this debate? And the second question is political, and it's related to this. From the political commentaries that I read, there is a possibility of a lost generation, like in Japan. What do you think is the likelihood of having a stagnating 2 decade in the United States? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm going to evade your first question. It's complicated and not totally my department. The second question, though, there's a political dimension to it and there's an economic dimension to it. The economic dimension is what's going to happen to the United States economy and the economic welfare of the majority of the United States population over the next decade. And there, I have to say that for fairly deep, fairly fundamental reasons, I'm rather pessimistic. I don't see any short-term way of reversing the inequality, the trends with regard to inequality in the United States, and those things are now, those are in many cases fundamental structural things. I mean, for example, high school graduation rates in South Korea are over 95%. The high school graduation rate in the United States is 78%. The high school graduation rate in the United States has been declining for the past decade. Slightly, but it has been declining. And that's not something that, when you match that against the skill requirements required for high-wage jobs in the United States and in the world in general, that's not something that you're going to reverse quickly. That's something that, if it's going to be reversed, is going to take, a substantial period of serious investment in the educational system and perhaps in related parts of the social system. And so I think that, unfortunately, there's a very high probability that for a substantial period of time, particularly younger people in the United States are going to feel quite rationally that their economic prospects are sharply constrained and that their income and wealth levels and standard of living are likely to be flat or declining and likely to be lower than those of their parents. Yes, sir.
Okay. Can I? Hi.
Yes. I'm Professor Petri from Harvard University. I want to respond to your statement, which is obvious, how difficult it is to explain or to find the reason, not only why it happened, but how to tackle it and how to resolve it. And I thought also, as you, until recently, I reread Marx. I come from a country where I was forced to read Marx, and I hated it and I didn't understand. Now, after just 2-3 months ago, I took back, and suddenly it opened my mind. I don't know whether you did it. It really explains not only how it happened, because we know that, but how to resolve it. It does explain. It explains in a totally different way. You have to tackle it, you have to resolve it in a Marxist way, but not in a communist way from where I escaped, like Stalin or Lenin or Tito or others, but in a way which is also totally different how many people are trying to do it now, which are also polishing things, and as I see, you are saying that you don't know. Try to read, and it will explain. I don't know how it is, but he said so many interesting things which are going into deep into the matter, and it cannot be resolved in the way how we are trying to do it now. It's more deeply, and problem is that it cannot be resolved not even with dictatorship, as in communist countries, and not with this polishing and trying to do the same, only to mask things and making them even worse.
I actually spent I spent several years reading Marx quite carefully under Joshua Cohen, who was a professor of political science and philosophy here at MIT, who's now at Stanford, and a quite serious political theorist. I took lots of political philosophy. I happen not to be a Marxist, but that's a discussion for another day. Sir.
I'm from a country which has adapted a parliamentary system, namely Germany, and we haven't been able to do much against what you've described as these financial mechanisms that led to a crisis. And I just want to put that forth as an example of how I think a parliamentary system may not be the solution, since there's all kind of other problems coming up with entries of barriers as well. I'd rather, from my view of American history, I think what has worked very well in the American system in certain periods was the strong executive, which comes with the presidential system. I think that's something that